What if the most powerful message Queen Elizabeth ever left behind was not spoken aloud, but hidden in ink? Think about that for a second. Not a speech, not a balcony wave, not a carefully rehearsed Christmas address. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. But a sentence. Quiet. Legal. Sealed. And according to whispers now circling the palace, that sentence may have frozen the future of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle in a way no interview, no memoir, and no royal statement ever could. Here's the shocking question no one is asking out loud. What if the Queen's final act wasn't about dividing wealth, but forcing a reckoning? Because if the reports are true, this wasn't just a will. It was a test of loyalty, a test of forgiveness, a test of whether blood still mattered more than pride. And the man who allegedly discovered it? King Charles himself, not as a father, not as a mediator, but as a monarch suddenly holding a document that could either reunite his family or tear it apart forever. Let's slow this down. Royal wills are not like normal wills. They are not read publicly. They are not dissected line by line on morning television. They are sealed, protected, and buried beneath layers of legal silence, sometimes for decades. So when rumors emerge that something inside Queen Elizabeth's will carries conditions, emotional ones, it immediately raises an uncomfortable question. Why now? Why would something so sensitive surface after her death? After Charles takes the throne, after Harry and Meghan have already stepped away, spoken out, and drawn battle lines in public? And more importantly, why would this alleged clause involve reconciliation? Because reconciliation is not money. It's not property. It's not jewelry or trusts or estates. Reconciliation is personal, messy, uncontrollable, impossible to enforce, which makes this story far more dangerous than a simple inheritance dispute. According to the narrative now spreading, Queen Elizabeth inserted a condition stating that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle would need to repair family ties before accessing any inheritance connected to her estate. Let that sink in. Not apologize. Not return to royal duties. Not move back to the UK. Repair family ties. What does that even mean? Is a phone call enough? A private meeting? A public apology? Or silence? And who decides when a family is healed? The Queen? Charles? William? History? Here's where the tension begins to tighten. Because the same reports claim that when King Charles became aware of this clause, fully aware, he didn't feel relief. He felt trapped. Imagine that moment. A son reading his mother's final wishes. A king realizing those wishes put him in the middle of his two sons. A father suddenly holding leverage he never asked for. And then comes the line that reportedly stunned those around him. I won't force my sons together under threat of inheritance. I cannot accept this. If that quote is even close to true, it changes everything. Because it means the clause didn't empower Charles. It burdened him. And that raises a question that should make every viewer pause. What kind of woman would Queen Elizabeth have to be to leave behind a condition even her own son felt uncomfortable enforcing? To understand that, we have to look at the Queen not as an icon, but as a grandmother watching her family fracture in slow motion. By the time of her final years, the cracks were no longer private. Harry and Meghan had stepped away from royal life. Interviews had been given, accusations made, books written, lines drawn. The family that once closed ranks had begun to speak through lawyers, aides, and headlines. And through it all, the Queen stayed mostly silent. That silence has often been interpreted as strength. But what if it was something else? What if it was restraint? What if the Queen believed that stepping in publicly would only make things worse, but doing nothing felt unbearable? This is where the idea of the clause becomes emotionally explosive. Because if true, it suggests Queen Elizabeth understood something deeply human. That families don't heal when forced, but they also don't heal when ignored. So she did what monarchs do best. She planned ahead, not with a speech, not with a decree, but with a condition that would only matter once she was gone. A final nudge, a last attempt to pull her family back together without being there to witness the fallout. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable contradiction in this entire story. The clause doesn't punish Harry and Meghan. It challenges them. And at the same time, it challenges Charles. Because by inserting reconciliation into a legal document, the Queen would have effectively passed the emotional responsibility down the line. Suddenly, Charles isn't just king. He's the gatekeeper of a deeply personal question. Has my family healed enough? And that is not a role any parent wants, especially one already accused of emotional distance, especially one already struggling to balance duty and fatherhood, especially one already watching his sons exist on opposite sides of the world. Now ask yourself this. If you were Harry, how would you receive this? As manipulation? As love? As pressure? As blackmail dressed up as concern? Because from Harry's perspective, the inheritance has never been the point. He has spoken openly about wanting independence, about walking away from money tied to control, about protecting his family at all costs. So would this clause feel like a bridge or a trap? And then there's Meghan. No matter how careful the language, her name is always whispered in the background of every royal fracture. Supporters see a woman unfairly blamed. Critics see an outsider who accelerated the divide. But if this clause exists, it places her in an impossible position. Because reconciliation would not be between Harry and Charles alone. It would involve William. It would involve Kate. It would involve a family dynamic already poisoned by suspicion and resentment. So here's the real hook of this story. The inheritance may be frozen, but the emotional stakes are burning. This isn't about who gets what. It's about whether healing can ever be genuine when it comes with conditions. Whether love can survive when it's tied to deadlines and documents. Whether a grandmother's final wish can carry weight without becoming a weapon. And we're only just getting started. Because the next question changes the entire narrative. How did this clause allegedly come to light at all, when royal wills are meant to stay sealed? Because the moment that question is answered, everything else begins to unravel. Imagine a room in Buckingham Palace. Thick carpets, heavy curtains, the scent of polished wood, and somewhere, tucked in a drawer or a safe, a piece of paper that could change the course of a royal family's future. That paper is a will, but not just any will. Not the ordinary legal parchment listing properties, estates, and investments. This one allegedly contains a secret, a sentence, or maybe a paragraph that nobody was meant to see for years, maybe decades. What makes it shocking isn't the money. Millions, billions even, are expected in royal inheritances. No, what makes it extraordinary is the content. According to circulating reports, Queen Elizabeth included a condition. Harry and Meghan would not receive certain parts of her estate until they repaired family relationships, specifically with Charles and William. A clause that turns legal documents into a moral compass. But how does such a clause exist at all? And why would a queen who spent decades perfecting protocol and discretion leave behind something so emotionally explosive? Royal wills are notoriously private. They are read by lawyers, archivists, and sometimes just a single family member. Public scrutiny comes decades later, often after those involved are long gone. So the mere suggestion that this clause exists and that King Charles discovered it after ascending the throne sets the stage for a story of secrecy, shock, and emotional reckoning. The very first question that arises, how did Charles react when he allegedly saw it? The reports suggest that he felt conflicted, burdened, perhaps even trapped. A monarch, suddenly faced with a mandate that involves personal relationships rather than duty or governance. He reportedly said, "I won't force my sons together under threat of inheritance. I cannot accept this." That line, if true, instantly reframes the story. Charles was not empowered. He was placed in a moral dilemma of enormous proportions. To understand the gravity, we need to step back and examine how royal wills traditionally function. These are documents crafted with utmost care, often with multiple drafts and legal oversight, designed to protect both legacy and privacy. They list property, art, estates, trusts, and sometimes personal mementos. Every line is deliberate. Every word matters. Yet, despite centuries of tradition, the idea of including a condition that directly engages with the family's emotional health is virtually unprecedented. And then there's timing. This clause reportedly came to light only after Charles became king. That means Harry and Meghan had already distanced themselves from royal life, given interviews, and publicly shared grievances. The Queen, aware of the growing tensions, may have inserted this clause as a final attempt to influence outcomes from beyond the grave. Imagine that, a grandmother trying to guide reconciliation without a word spoken, without a conversation, only a line in a legal document. But why would Charles feel trapped rather than relieved? The answer lies in the impossibility of enforcing such a condition. Legal documents can dictate the transfer of wealth, but they cannot dictate forgiveness, presence, or love. How do you enforce a reconciliation? A public handshake? A private meeting? A written apology? None of these guarantees emotional repair, and yet, the clause, as reported, implies just that. Here's where the drama deepens. If this clause exists, it is not merely a family matter, it is a moral test. It forces each member to confront their own feelings of pride, resentment, and love. Harry, who has repeatedly spoken about wanting autonomy, independence, and emotional safety, is now potentially asked to reconsider relationships he has publicly distanced himself from. Meghan, whose presence in the family has often been politicized, is likewise caught in a web of expectation and legacy. And the most striking part? This clause reportedly does not specify a timeline. There is no deadline, no expiration date. It's not coercion in the traditional sense, but it is pressure, a psychological lever, a test of character from beyond the grave. And the man placed in the middle, Charles, is suddenly more judge than parent, more mediator than monarch, tasked with upholding a condition that he himself struggles to accept. Then there's William. How does the heir apparent respond when a clause like this surfaces? The speculation is intense. William has publicly remained measured, careful, and discreet. But privately, how does he reconcile this legal and emotional mandate? Does he see it as a tool to mend fractures, or as an imposition on relationships that have long since evolved or deteriorated? His silence is meaningful. It's a tension-filled pause that adds a layer of suspense to this already explosive narrative. And so we circle back to the document itself. What form does it take? Allegedly, it is as precise as any legal language could be, but emotionally loaded in a way legal documents rarely are. Every phrase is deliberate, every word chosen to carry weight beyond financial transactions. The Queen, in essence, may have encoded her values, her hopes, and her vision for family unity into legalese. A final act of guidance. A test disguised as inheritance. This raises an essential question for the audience. Can a family truly heal when conditions are imposed? And more personally, if you were Harry or Meghan, how would you respond? Would you perceive this as love or manipulation? Would you attempt to reconcile for the sake of legacy or for the sake of truth? And if you were Charles, how could you facilitate reconciliation without feeling like an enforcer of emotional compliance? Adding to the tension, this is not a theoretical scenario. Sources claim that the discovery of the clause shocked the palace. Charles reportedly did not rush to enforce it. Instead, he grappled with the ethical implications. The inheritance is frozen, yes, but more importantly, relationships are frozen in ambiguity, suspended in a liminal space where no one knows how or when healing might occur. At the same time, the media frenzy adds fuel to the fire. Every public statement by Harry and Meghan, every royal appearance, every rumored interaction is now examined through the lens of this clause. Fans, critics, and historians alike are left asking, is the clause a reflection of a monarch's foresight or a queen's last attempt to control an uncontrollable situation? It's easy to see why this story captivates so intensely. It's not just about money. It's about power, family, and the invisible strings that bind them. And perhaps most importantly, it's about human behavior under extreme pressure. A legal document, a family rift, and the burden of a king's conscience. These elements combine to create suspense, emotional resonance, and moral complexity. So what came next? How did Charles proceed once he realized the implications? What was Harry's first response? How did Meghan react to the possibility of a condition tied to emotional reconciliation? And how does the public play into all of this? The answers are not simple, and in the next chapter, we begin to uncover how this document emerged, how it allegedly reached the king's hands, and how a single line of text could shake the foundations of one of the world's most scrutinized families. What haunted Queen Elizabeth in her final years? Was it politics? Statecraft? The relentless demands of monarchy? Or was it something far more personal, far more intimate? A family that seemed to fracture faster than she could hold it together? For decades, the Queen mastered appearances. Stoic, measured, unwavering. To the world, she was the embodiment of stability, of duty, of endurance. But behind palace walls, in private corridors and quiet sitting rooms, the story was far more complicated. There were whispers of tension, of unresolved conflicts, of silences that spoke louder than words. And among the most painful of these were the rifts within her own children and grandchildren. Consider the context. Prince Charles had long struggled under the shadow of expectation, the weight of being heir apparent, the public scrutiny of his marriages, the constant comparison to the flawless queen. Prince William, the next in line, carefully cultivated an image of responsibility and poise. And then came Harry and Meghan, a couple who broke royal tradition, redefined public perception, and, in some eyes, widened the fissures within the family. The queen, according to insiders, was not naive. She understood that her family was evolving in ways she could not control. Harry's departure from royal duties, his interviews, and Meghan's outspoken nature were not mere disturbances. They represented a seismic shift in the royal ecosystem. What terrified her was not public scandal. It was that her own family, the people she had built her life around, might never find common ground again. Enter the alleged clause. By inserting a condition into her will, she was doing something unprecedented. Attempting to influence relationships after her death. It was a quiet, subtle, almost surgical intervention. She could no longer mediate disputes directly, but she could plant a seed, a legal nudge, that forced reflection, dialogue, and potentially reconciliation. The clause reportedly demanded more than a perfunctory gesture. It wasn't about a single meeting, a quick apology, or a symbolic appearance. It was about genuine repair. Healing wounds that had festered in private, wounds amplified by media coverage, rumors, and long-standing resentments. This was an emotional prescription wrapped in legal language, a paradox in itself. How do you codify love? How do you legislate forgiveness? And yet, that appears to have been her intention. Perhaps she recognized a truth many of us fear. Families often fracture not because of malice, but because of pride. Because misunderstandings go unspoken. Because years of expectation, disappointment, and differing perspectives accumulate silently, eventually creating a chasm that seems impossible to bridge. In the Queen's mind, time was critical. She could not predict when she would pass, nor could she foresee the speed at which Harry and Meghan might distance themselves. The clause served as a kind of temporal anchor, a mechanism to slow the drift, to provide a point of reflection, to offer hope that, even in her absence, the family might find its way back. Emotionally, the clause reflects deep foresight. It suggests that the Queen perceived both human nature and family dynamics with extraordinary clarity. She understood that money alone cannot mend relationships. She recognized that the siblings she loved deeply could, paradoxically, use wealth as leverage rather than a bridge. And she saw that the act of reconciliation had to be initiated not through coercion, but through moral choice. Yet, the clause also imposed a moral paradox. It effectively placed the responsibility of healing on those who had contributed to the fracture. Harry and Meghan, in the public narrative, were already cast in a complicated role, agents of disruption, advocates of independence, and yet deeply connected to the emotional heart of the monarchy. Asking them to reconcile was, on the one hand, a gesture of hope, and on the other, a challenge of extraordinary complexity. And then there is Charles, the Queen's son, heir, and now king. When the alleged clause surfaced, he reportedly did not feel empowered. Instead, he felt trapped. The document forced him to confront a painful reality. He could not simply enforce reconciliation through legal authority. He could not guarantee the emotional outcome the Queen desired. And yet, the responsibility now rested heavily on his shoulders. This is where the human dimension becomes unavoidable. Consider the emotional stakes. Charles had spent decades navigating public scrutiny, managing family relationships under the spotlight, and now he was faced with a document that asked him to mediate private reconciliation under extraordinary pressure. The inheritance was not merely financial. It was symbolic, a representation of love, legacy, and trust. And by tying it to emotional repair, the Queen effectively transformed her estate into a moral experiment. From Harry and Meghan's perspective, the implications are profound. Harry has long articulated his desire for independence and emotional autonomy. Meghan, whose relationship with the family has been both scrutinized and criticized, faces an added layer of expectation. The clause, if true, does not merely ask them to reconcile. It challenges them to evaluate their own priorities, motivations, and values in relation to their family. And the public? The world is watching, as always. Every royal interview, every public appearance, every statement is interpreted through a lens of speculation. But no one outside the inner circle can truly know the nuances, the private conversations, the unspoken agreements, and the tensions that shape these relationships. The clause, therefore, functions as both a private moral directive and a public enigma, a puzzle only the family can solve, but one the world cannot ignore. There's an irony here worth noting. A queen who ruled nations, who orchestrated state affairs with precision, whose decisions affected millions, chose in her final act to focus on the most personal, uncontrollable, and fragile aspect of her life, her family. This was not governance. It was love, fear, hope, and strategy, all encoded in a few sentences of legal prose. As we reflect on this, it's important to recognize the stakes. This is not a theoretical dilemma. According to insiders, the discovery of the clause created immediate tension within the palace. Charles's reported response, refusing to act as an enforcer, highlights the delicate balance between duty and emotion. And as we will explore in the next chapter, William's perspective adds another layer of complexity, further illustrating how one line of text can ripple across generations, altering perceptions, choices, and relationships in profound ways. So here we pause, at the edge of revelation. The Queen, in her wisdom, may have anticipated all possibilities: compliance, resistance, anger, or reconciliation. The stage is set, the players are positioned, and the world is left to wonder. Can a family truly heal when the impetus comes from a will, when love and pride collide under the weight of expectation? Imagine a young prince growing up in the world's most scrutinized family, adored by millions, yet constantly aware of every misstep, every public glance, every word spoken. Prince Harry's early life was, by all accounts, marked by affection, privilege, and responsibility. But even amidst the pomp and ceremony, there was a duality, a contrast between the warmth of family moments behind closed doors and the relentless scrutiny of a global audience. Fast forward to the present, and the narrative seems almost unrecognizable. Harry and Meghan Markle, once welcomed with curiosity and cautious optimism, now stand at the center of a storm fueled by both admiration and criticism. Their departure from official royal duties, the controversial interviews, the memoirs, and the public discussions of family dynamics have created a complex and highly charged context for the alleged clause in Queen Elizabeth's will. But let's take a step back and explore the trajectory. Harry's early position in the royal family was one of careful favor. He was the younger son, beloved for his charisma, sense of humor, and, eventually, his willingness to challenge certain aspects of tradition in small ways. Meghan, on the other hand, entered a world of rigid expectations, ceremonial duty, and unspoken codes of conduct. Her presence, initially embraced, soon became a point of tension, magnified by media scrutiny and public speculation. It's in this context that the alleged clause gains weight. If Harry and Meghan were once favored, protected, supported, encouraged, why would their inheritance now be frozen, conditional on emotional repair? The answer lies not in punishment, but in timing and symbolism. The Queen, aware of growing tensions and the distance between her son and grandson, may have sought to create a framework that encouraged reconciliation without overtly coercing it. Harry, in particular, has always valued independence. Reports suggest that from the early stages of his adult life, he desired to carve out a space that was authentically his own, away from the constraints and expectations of royal duty. Meghan's entrance into his life coincided with this pursuit, and together, they have pursued financial and personal independence while navigating intense public scrutiny. This dynamic is central to understanding how the alleged clause might impact them psychologically and emotionally. Consider the implications. The clause reportedly demands repair, engagement with Charles and William, not as a formality, but as a meaningful restoration of relationships. For Harry, who has been vocal about the challenges of his upbringing, the pressures of duty, and the limitations imposed by royal protocol. This could feel like a monumental expectation. Reconciliation is not simply a conversation. It's an emotional undertaking that requires vulnerability, trust, and acknowledgement of past wounds. And Meghan? Her role complicates everything further. While Harry's motivations are tied to family history and personal identity, Meghan's relationship with the family has been heavily politicized, scrutinized, and, at times, misrepresented. The clause, by necessity, involves her. Any effort toward reconciliation would not be unilateral. It would require both partners to navigate a delicate web of expectations, historical grievances, and public perception. The weight of that responsibility, coupled with the emotional stakes, transforms the inheritance from a financial matter into a moral and relational crucible. It's important to recognize the psychological dimension here. Human behavior under pressure is rarely linear. Emotions are unpredictable. Pride, resentment, and loyalty collide. Harry and Meghan are not merely reacting to the clause. They are responding to a lifetime of experiences, public narratives, and personal values. In this light, the inheritance becomes a symbol, a tangible representation of the larger challenge. Can a family reconcile when wounds are deep, history is complex, and stakes are both emotional and material? Furthermore, the timing amplifies the drama. By the time the alleged clause came to light, Harry and Meghan had already established a new life, physically and psychologically distant from the traditional royal sphere. They had cultivated financial independence, personal projects, and a public platform that allows them to define their narrative. Asking them to repair relationships at this juncture is not simply a request. It is an invitation into emotional labor that may feel both urgent and intrusive. This is where the metaphor of frozen inheritance becomes particularly powerful. It is not a matter of dollars and pounds. It is a pause, a suspension, a liminal space in which wealth, legacy, and emotion intersect. The freeze is symbolic, representing the unresolved tensions, the unspoken regrets, and the unfinished conversations that define the family dynamic. It is a state of waiting, a reminder that some legacies are not measured in property or investments, but in human connection. Consider the narrative arc. Once favored, Harry and Meghan are now positioned at a crossroads. The path forward is not obvious, the stakes are personal, and the outcomes are uncertain. The alleged clause transforms the inheritance into a moral and relational challenge, one that asks them to confront past actions, evaluate intentions, and engage in repair that is authentic, not performative. And yet, the public lens complicates the picture further. Every choice, every hesitation, every gesture is scrutinized, interpreted, and debated. The media narrative often reduces complex human dynamics into simplified tropes: rebellious prince, ambitious outsider, fractured family. But the reality, as suggested by the existence of the clause, is far more nuanced. It is a story of human emotion intersecting with legacy, of love and loyalty measured against history, pride, and public expectation. At the heart of this tension lies a question that resonates universally. How do we reconcile with those we love when circumstances, expectations, and personal growth have driven a wedge between us? For Harry and Meghan, the answer is complicated by the public nature of their lives, the legal implications of inheritance, and the presence of multiple stakeholders: Charles, William, Kate, and the extended royal family. Each perspective adds layers of complexity, amplifying the emotional stakes and highlighting the delicate balance between personal desire and familial duty. And here lies the cliffhanger that propels us forward. The clause reportedly names reconciliation as a prerequisite, but it does not define it. It is intentionally ambiguous, a mirror reflecting the intentions, values, and priorities of those who read it. How Harry and Meghan interpret this instruction, and whether they choose to act upon it, will shape not only their inheritance but the emotional legacy of a queen who, even in death, sought to guide her family with subtle precision. Reconciliation. It's a word that sounds simple at first, soft, even hopeful. But in the context of the British royal family, it is anything but. One syllable carries the weight of decades of history, heartbreak, and public scrutiny. It is, paradoxically, both a bridge and a battlefield. And according to the alleged clause in Queen Elizabeth's will, it is the key that unlocks Harry and Meghan's inheritance. Let's pause and consider the complexity. What does reconciliation actually entail in a family like this? Is it a private phone call, a formal meeting in a palace sitting room, or a public appearance for the press? Does it require forgiveness, acknowledgement of wrongdoing, or simply the act of showing up? The Queen, in her wisdom, may have intentionally left the term ambiguous. Perhaps she understood that true reconciliation cannot be dictated, it must be chosen. For Harry and Meghan, the stakes are immense. Harry has spoken about his struggles, his grief over his mother's death, his feelings of alienation within the family, and his desire for autonomy. Meghan has been vocal, both directly and indirectly, about the pressures of royal life and the scrutiny she faced from media and family alike. Asking either of them to reconcile is not merely a request. It is a call to confront raw emotions, past traumas, and deeply ingrained perceptions of loyalty and fairness. From Charles's perspective, the word reconciliation is equally fraught. He is tasked not only with navigating his own relationships, but also with honoring his mother's final wishes without imposing control. According to reports, Charles was unsettled by the clause, feeling that it placed him in a position where his son's private emotions were now legally tethered to his authority. "I won't force my sons together under threat of inheritance," he reportedly said. The statement underscores the ethical and emotional tension inherent in a word that, in practice, cannot be enforced by legal means. This ambiguity is part of what makes the clause so dramatic. Reconciliation is simultaneously a demand and a possibility, a requirement and a choice. It embodies the paradox of human relationships, that love, forgiveness, and understanding cannot be legislated, yet the hope of healing often depends on structure, guidance, and, sometimes, subtle coercion. The Queen, who spent her life mastering protocol, seems to have recognized this tension and encoded it in the most formal of formats, a legal document. But what does reconciliation look like practically in this situation? A series of private discussions? Public gestures of unity? A collaborative charitable initiative? Perhaps all of the above. Or maybe none of them would ever suffice. The Queen's clause, as reported, does not prescribe actions. It leaves room for interpretation, forcing Harry and Meghan, and, indirectly, Charles and William, to navigate their own definitions of healing, trust, and family. The emotional stakes are amplified by timing and context. Harry and Meghan are no longer living in the UK full-time. They have established a life in North America, cultivated financial independence, and publicly articulated boundaries with the royal family. Any effort at reconciliation requires a willingness to traverse physical, emotional, and psychological distances. It demands engagement on terms that may feel unfamiliar or uncomfortable, while simultaneously being observed, analyzed, and judged by a global audience. This is where the moral complexity intensifies. Reconciliation, by its nature, demands vulnerability. It requires acknowledgement of past pain and mistakes, empathy for differing perspectives, and a willingness to risk further disappointment. For Harry, Meghan, Charles, and William, these are not abstract challenges. They are deeply personal, high-stakes negotiations where pride, loyalty, and love intersect under extraordinary scrutiny. Interestingly, the clause reportedly does not define consequences for failure. The inheritance is frozen, yes, but there is no explicit penalty, no detailed enforcement mechanism. This absence of clarity magnifies the psychological tension. Harry and Meghan may interpret the clause as pressure, manipulation, or an opportunity. Charles may feel burdened by the weight of moral responsibility. William may see a chance for healing or a potential complication. Every interpretation adds layers of suspense and unpredictability. From a storytelling perspective, the ambiguity of reconciliation is pure dramatic gold. It allows for suspense, emotional spikes, and moral questioning. It poses a universal dilemma. Can fractured relationships be mended when expectations are undefined, histories are complex, and observers are relentless? For the audience, it invites reflection. If placed in a similar position, would you act out of love, fear, obligation, or principle? And the emotional stakes do not end there. Reconciliation is not a linear process. One attempt may fail, another may succeed, and the journey itself may expose additional wounds. Harry and Meghan's decisions could ripple across the family, affecting not only immediate relationships, but also the public narrative of the monarchy. Every gesture, or lack thereof, becomes symbolic, charged with meaning far beyond its immediate context. The Queen, in inserting this clause, reportedly demonstrated profound insight into both human behavior and familial dynamics. She understood that love and forgiveness are unpredictable, yet she also recognized that a clear, tangible incentive, however complex, might encourage reflection, dialogue, and, ultimately, repair. Her intervention, quiet yet deliberate, transforms a legal document into a moral compass, guiding her family from beyond the grave. As the chapter comes to a close, one question hangs in the air. If reconciliation is essential to unlocking inheritance, yet cannot be forced, how will Harry and Meghan respond? Will they see it as a challenge, a manipulative tactic, or an invitation to reflect on their own choices and values? And for Charles and William, how will they navigate the tension between duty, love, and personal boundaries? The next chapter will reveal Charles's alleged response to this unprecedented situation, the emotional, ethical, and psychological weight of becoming both king and reluctant mediator. Imagine standing in a quiet room, a legal document in your hands, your mother gone, and the weight of the monarchy pressing down on you. Every word matters. Every decision could ripple through history. Now imagine reading a clause that asks you to mediate the reconciliation of your sons, a responsibility that no king has ever been forced to bear. According to reports, this was King Charles's moment of reckoning, and instead of feeling relief or empowerment, he reportedly felt trapped. "I won't force my sons together under threat of inheritance. I cannot accept this." That line, attributed to Charles, is more than just a quote. It is a revelation of his inner conflict, a mixture of love, duty, and moral principle colliding in a moment of profound intensity. For years, Charles has been portrayed as a man under pressure, heir apparent for decades, navigating his own complex relationships and balancing personal desire against duty. Now, with the Queen's final wishes in his hands, he faced a moral and emotional dilemma unlike any other. Let's unpack why this reaction is so compelling. The clause, as reported, was designed to incentivize reconciliation. In theory, it gave Charles leverage, a tangible tool to encourage his sons to repair their relationship. But human emotions are never as neat as legal contracts. Charles recognized that forcing reconciliation is impossible. Relationships cannot be legislated, manipulated, or coerced without causing further harm. By refusing to act as an enforcer, he upheld both his integrity and the delicate balance of family dynamics, but at a cost. This refusal underscores the paradox of the situation. The inheritance was frozen, a tangible prize, yet the real test was emotional. Charles was not being asked to redistribute wealth or manage estates. He was being asked to mediate hearts. And as any parent knows, this is often the hardest task of all. He had to balance empathy for Harry and Meghan's experiences with the responsibilities he now carried as king, all while respecting his mother's final wishes. There's also a historical lens to consider. Monarchs have long been advisors, mediators, and even arbiters in personal and political disputes. But the Queen's alleged clause transforms the traditional role of the sovereign. Charles is now both ruler and reluctant emotional facilitator, a dual responsibility he may never have anticipated. And because this is tied to inheritance, the stakes are not abstract. They are concrete, pressing, and deeply personal. It's important to consider the human psychology at play. Charles reportedly felt the weight of legacy, morality, and familial obligation all at once. He understood that pressing Harry and Meghan to reconcile might yield surface-level gestures, but genuine repair of relationships requires consent, willingness, and emotional labor. By refusing to coerce his sons, he arguably preserved the integrity of the family dynamic, even while complicating the immediate issue of inheritance. Yet, his refusal also introduces tension. If the king does not act as a mediator, who will? Who will ensure that the intentions behind the Queen's clause are honored? The document, after all, is both directive and ambiguous. It demands repair, but does not provide instructions, timelines, or enforcement mechanisms. Charles's reluctance leaves the responsibility largely in the hands of those most affected, Harry and Meghan, while he navigates his own moral compass. From the perspective of William and the wider family, this refusal may also be challenging. William, the heir apparent, is caught between loyalty to his father, his own role in the family, and the public eye. How does he respond when the clause surfaces and Charles declines to act as an enforcer? His silence, interpreted by some as caution, by others as complicity, adds another layer of suspense and uncertainty. Meanwhile, for Harry and Meghan, Charles's stance is both liberating and complicated. On one hand, they are not being forced into interaction. On the other, the responsibility now rests squarely on their shoulders. The inheritance is frozen. The emotional stakes are high. The world is watching. Every move they make, or choose not to make, is magnified, analyzed, and judged. This scenario also illustrates a profound irony. The Queen, whose life was defined by order, duty, and control, crafted a clause that removes control from the very person charged with executing it. By doing so, she entrusted Charles with a paradox: to respect autonomy while honoring intention. It's a moral tightrope that blends the personal, legal, and emotional in a way few could navigate. And yet, Charles's reported statement is not one of despair, it is one of principle. He refuses to act as a lever for manipulation, asserting a moral stance even when faced with potential criticism, public scrutiny, and personal discomfort. It reflects a recognition that reconciliation cannot be forced, even by a king, even with wealth and legacy dangling as incentives. As this chapter closes, the tension escalates. Charles's refusal sets the stage for a narrative in which choices, values, and personal responsibility dominate over legal obligation. It raises the question: if the king will not enforce reconciliation, how will the family respond? Will Harry and Meghan rise to the challenge? Will William step in? Or will the inheritance remain frozen, suspended in a limbo of unresolved emotion and historical weight? In any family, silence can speak volumes. In the royal family, it can echo across continents. William, the Prince of Wales, has long been known for his measured, disciplined demeanor, a man who weighs every word, every gesture, every public appearance with meticulous care. But when the alleged clause in Queen Elizabeth's will surfaced, his silence became something more, a loaded question in itself, one that demanded interpretation from all sides. Think about it. William is the heir apparent, the public face of continuity and stability. He has spent decades learning the delicate art of balancing duty with personal conviction, public expectation with private loyalty. Now, confronted with a clause that calls for reconciliation between Harry and Meghan and links it directly to inheritance, William finds himself in a peculiar position. His role is ambiguous. He is not legally responsible for enforcement. That falls, at least symbolically, to King Charles, but he is emotionally entangled. Every decision he makes, or avoids making, will influence the family dynamic, the public narrative, and perhaps the ultimate outcome of the Queen's conditional legacy. The silence may, on the surface, appear strategic. William has always been careful, measured, and deliberate in his actions. Acting prematurely could ignite conflict, alienate Harry and Meghan further, or create a public spectacle he desperately wants to avoid. By staying silent, he maintains a kind of equilibrium, a neutral ground that allows events to unfold without overt interference. Yet silence can also be a reflection of pain. Behind the composed exterior, William may be struggling with resentment, disappointment, or grief. The fractured relationships with his brother, compounded by media scrutiny and public perception, are not easily ignored. Every headline, every interview, every rumor acts as a magnifying glass, highlighting rifts that are already raw and unresolved. In this context, silence may not be strategy alone. It may be self-protection, a buffer against emotional exposure. Consider the psychology of the situation. William has witnessed, firsthand, the intense pressures of royal life. He has observed how missteps are amplified, how intentions are misinterpreted, and how media narratives can shape perception as much as reality. Entering the reconciliation equation publicly or privately could place him at risk, emotionally, politically, and reputationally. Silence, paradoxically, becomes a tool, allowing him to navigate a minefield without triggering additional conflict. But this silence is not benign. Every day of inaction adds tension. For Harry and Meghan, the lack of engagement from William, and, by extension, the family, may feel like an obstacle, an unspoken judgment, or even a barrier to true reconciliation. It forces them to interpret motives, read between lines, and make decisions without full clarity. And in a family where misinterpretation has historically fueled conflict, silence can be as powerful as any spoken word. Meanwhile, the public observes. Every appearance, every statement, or lack thereof, is scrutinized. Speculation runs rampant. Is William taking the moral high ground, waiting for the right moment to act? Or is he withholding engagement out of anger, disappointment, or wounded pride? The ambiguity amplifies the drama. The world becomes part of the emotional equation, and the stakes grow beyond the family into the realm of public perception and historical legacy. Interestingly, silence also forces Charles's hand in subtle ways. By refusing to act as an enforcer, and with William remaining deliberately quiet, Charles is left to navigate the tension with minimal support. He cannot compel reconciliation, cannot dictate behavior, and must respect autonomy while honoring his mother's wishes. It is a balancing act, one that demonstrates the complexity of combining emotional responsibility with royal duty. For Harry and Meghan, William's silence may feel like a test of character. Does it represent opportunity, challenge, or judgment? And how they respond, whether with outreach, caution, or defiance, will inevitably shape the outcome of the Queen's conditional clause. The stakes are deeply personal. Relationships, trust, legacy, and public image all hang in the balance. But silence is a double-edged sword. While it protects, it also pressures. It leaves space for interpretation, doubt, and uncertainty. It invites speculation, fuels tension, and amplifies emotional stakes. In the royal family, where tradition, duty, and public perception intersect, silence is never just silence. It is a statement, a strategy, and sometimes a wound that continues to bleed quietly beneath the surface. And this sets the stage for Harry's dilemma. With inheritance frozen and reconciliation ambiguous, Harry must confront his own priorities, values, and sense of agency. The clause, now entwined with his personal and public identity, becomes both a challenge and an opportunity. A test of whether he will choose to act, and if so, how. As we prepare to move to the next chapter, consider the tension in this triangular dynamic. Charles, burdened by responsibility. William, silent yet influential. Harry and Meghan, navigating expectation, autonomy, and public scrutiny. Each decision, each pause, each emotional choice carries immense weight. For Prince Harry, life has always been lived under the glare of global attention, a spotlight that magnifies every decision, every misstep, every act of defiance. From his earliest years, he learned that the monarchy demands both compliance and courage, obedience and individuality, a paradox few can navigate without scars. And now, faced with the alleged clause in Queen Elizabeth's will, he confronts a dilemma unlike any before: autonomy versus legacy. Think about it. The inheritance is frozen. A substantial portion of wealth, assets, and legacy rests on a single condition: reconciliation. But Harry has already carved out a life that reflects his values: independence, protection of family, and freedom from the rigid protocols of royal life. How does he reconcile these choices with a clause that seems to tether emotional obligation to financial reward? At first glance, one might think this is simply about money. Millions, estates, jewels, and property. But for Harry, the issue has always been deeper. It's about agency, control over his own life, the ability to define his family on his own terms, to act without coercion, expectation, or public manipulation. The clause, in essence, challenges that autonomy by creating a moral and emotional tether. The psychological pressure is enormous. Harry must consider the implications of responding. Does he engage in reconciliation for personal gain, or does he attempt to mend relationships out of genuine desire and emotional honesty? Does he risk reopening old wounds, exposing himself and Meghan to potential judgment, criticism, or betrayal? And how does he navigate this while maintaining the life he has deliberately built, away from the public eye, yet constantly observed? Then there is Meghan. Her perspective adds complexity. Harry is not acting alone. Every potential step toward reconciliation carries implications for her, her autonomy, safety, and emotional well-being. Together, they must weigh the risks of engagement against the symbolic power of the Queen's clause. It's a delicate balance: personal integrity versus inherited expectation, public perception versus private reality. The stakes are not hypothetical. Historical context demonstrates that royal family dynamics are rarely private, and any perceived misstep can reverberate globally. Harry's decisions, while personal, are inevitably viewed through the lens of public narrative: rebellious prince, estranged son, protective husband, devoted father. The clause amplifies this scrutiny, transforming a legal instrument into a catalyst for emotional and moral judgment. And let's not forget timing. Harry and Meghan have already taken steps to distance themselves from royal life. They have pursued careers, media ventures, and philanthropic projects that reflect their identity outside the monarchy. Engaging with reconciliation now would require navigating not only personal history, but also public expectation, media framing, and the shadow of historical family dynamics. Every action becomes symbolic, every choice scrutinized. This creates an emotional paradox. On one hand, reconciliation offers potential closure, healing, and restoration. On the other, it threatens autonomy, independence, and the carefully constructed life Harry and Meghan have created. The clause, then, functions as both challenge and opportunity, a lever that presses on psychological, emotional, and relational dimensions simultaneously. Consider the morality of the situation. Harry is faced with a question that resonates universally. When does obligation override autonomy? When does love demand compromise? And when does legacy become both motivation and burden? These are not legal questions. They are deeply human, ethical dilemmas that extend far beyond the confines of palace walls. Public perception further complicates the landscape. Every interview, every social media post, every appearance by Harry or Meghan becomes part of the ongoing narrative. How they respond to the clause, whether with engagement, silence, or defiance, will shape both family dynamics and public understanding. The inheritance is not just financial. It is symbolic, representing the intersection of love, obligation, and historical expectation. And so Harry's dilemma intensifies. He must weigh personal values against family expectation, autonomy against legacy, independence against emotional responsibility. Every choice carries risk. Every hesitation is amplified. Every action, or inaction, is observed. The stakes are not just material. They are deeply emotional, ethical, and symbolic. This brings us to a critical question. How will Harry respond? Will he embrace the challenge, seeing reconciliation as an opportunity to repair not only family ties, but his own relationship with the monarchy? Or will he assert independence, prioritizing personal integrity and autonomy over inherited obligation? And what role will Meghan play in shaping that choice, balancing her own experiences, values, and sense of safety against the emotional demands of the clause? As we close this chapter, one fact is clear: Harry's decisions will ripple through the family, the monarchy, and the public narrative. Every moment of hesitation, every choice of engagement, every gesture toward, or away from, reconciliation becomes a piece of a high-stakes moral and emotional puzzle. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. For Prince Harry, life has always been lived under the glare of global attention, a spotlight that magnifies every decision, every misstep, every act of defiance. From his earliest years, he learned that the monarchy demands both compliance and courage, obedience and individuality, a paradox few can navigate without scars. And now, faced with the alleged clause in Queen Elizabeth's will, he confronts a dilemma unlike any before: autonomy versus legacy. Think about it. The inheritance is frozen. A substantial portion of wealth, assets, and legacy rests on a single condition: reconciliation. But Harry has already carved out a life that reflects his values, independence, protection of family, and freedom from the rigid protocols of royal life. How does he reconcile these choices with a clause that seems to tether emotional obligation to financial reward? At first glance, one might think this is simply about money. Millions, estates, jewels, and property. But for Harry, the issue has always been deeper. It's about agency, control over his own life, the ability to define his family on his own terms, to act without coercion, expectation, or public manipulation. The clause, in essence, challenges that autonomy by creating a moral and emotional tether. The psychological pressure is enormous. Harry must consider the implications of responding. Does he engage in reconciliation for personal gain, or does he attempt to mend relationships out of genuine desire and emotional honesty? Does he risk reopening old wounds, exposing himself and Meghan to potential judgment, criticism, or betrayal? And how does he navigate this while maintaining the life he has deliberately built, away from the public eye, yet constantly observed? Then there is Meghan. Her perspective adds complexity. Harry is not acting alone. Every potential step toward reconciliation carries implications for her, her autonomy, safety, and emotional well-being. Together, they must weigh the risks of engagement against the symbolic power of the Queen's clause. It's a delicate balance. Personal integrity versus inherited expectation, public perception versus private reality. The stakes are not hypothetical. Historical context demonstrates that royal family dynamics are rarely private, and any perceived misstep can reverberate globally. Harry's decisions, while personal, are inevitably viewed through the lens of public narrative: rebellious prince, estranged son, protective husband, devoted father. The clause amplifies this scrutiny, transforming a legal instrument into a catalyst for emotional and moral judgment. And let's not forget timing. Harry and Meghan have already taken steps to distance themselves from royal life. They have pursued careers, media ventures, and philanthropic projects that reflect their identity outside the monarchy. Engaging with reconciliation now would require navigating not only personal history, but also public expectation, media framing, and the shadow of historical family dynamics. Every action becomes symbolic, every choice scrutinized. This creates an emotional paradox. On one hand, reconciliation offers potential closure, healing, and restoration. On the other, it threatens autonomy, independence, and the carefully constructed life Harry and Meghan have created. The clause, then, functions as both challenge and opportunity, a lever that presses on psychological, emotional, and relational dimensions simultaneously. Consider the morality of the situation. Harry is faced with a question that resonates universally. When does obligation override autonomy? When does love demand compromise? And when does legacy become both motivation and burden? These are not legal questions. They are deeply human, ethical dilemmas that extend far beyond the confines of palace walls. Public perception further complicates the landscape. Every interview, every social media post, every appearance by Harry or Meghan becomes part of the ongoing narrative. How they respond to the clause, whether with engagement, silence, or defiance, will shape both family dynamics and public understanding. The inheritance is not just financial. It is symbolic, representing the intersection of love, obligation, and historical expectation. And so Harry's dilemma intensifies. He must weigh personal values against family expectation, autonomy against legacy, independence against emotional responsibility. Every choice carries risk. Every hesitation is amplified. Every action, or inaction, is observed. The stakes are not just material. They are deeply emotional, ethical, and symbolic. This brings us to a critical question. How will Harry respond? Will he embrace the challenge, seeing reconciliation as an opportunity to repair not only family ties, but his own relationship with the monarchy? Or will he assert independence, prioritizing personal integrity and autonomy over inherited obligation? And what role will Meghan play in shaping that choice, balancing her own experiences, values, and sense of safety against the emotional demands of the clause? As we close this chapter, one fact is clear. Harry's decisions will ripple through the family, the monarchy, and the public narrative. Every moment of hesitation, every choice of engagement, every gesture toward or away from reconciliation, becomes a piece of a high-stakes moral and emotional puzzle. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. For Prince Harry, life has always been lived under the glare of global attention, a spotlight that magnifies every decision, every misstep, every act of defiance. From his earliest years, he learned that the monarchy demands both compliance and courage, obedience and individuality, a paradox few can navigate without scars. And now, faced with the alleged clause in Queen Elizabeth's will, he confronts a dilemma unlike any before: autonomy versus legacy. Think about it. The inheritance is frozen. A substantial portion of wealth, assets, and legacy rests on a single condition: reconciliation. But Harry has already carved out a life that reflects his values: independence, protection of family, and freedom from the rigid protocols of royal life. How does he reconcile these choices with a clause that seems to tether emotional obligation to financial reward? At first glance, one might think this is simply about money: millions, estates, jewels, and property. But for Harry, the issue has always been deeper. It's about agency, control over his own life, the ability to define his family on his own terms, to act without coercion, expectation, or public manipulation. The clause, in essence, challenges that autonomy by creating a moral and emotional tether. The psychological pressure is enormous. Harry must consider the implications of responding. Does he engage in reconciliation for personal gain, or does he attempt to mend relationships out of genuine desire and emotional honesty? Does he risk reopening old wounds, exposing himself and Meghan to potential judgment, criticism, or betrayal? And how does he navigate this while maintaining the life he has deliberately built, away from the public eye, yet constantly observed? Then there is Meghan. Her perspective adds complexity. Harry is not acting alone. Every potential step toward reconciliation carries implications for her, her autonomy, safety, and emotional well-being. Together, they must weigh the risks of engagement against the symbolic power of the Queen's clause. It's a delicate balance: personal integrity versus inherited expectation, public perception versus private reality. The stakes are not hypothetical. Historical context demonstrates that royal family dynamics are rarely private, and any perceived misstep can reverberate globally. Harry's decisions, while personal, are inevitably viewed through the lens of public narrative: rebellious prince, estranged son, protective husband, devoted father. The clause amplifies this scrutiny, transforming a legal instrument into a catalyst for emotional and moral judgment.